Hi, skeptics and pseudo-skeptics and sometimes skeptics and even believers. Well, we're all believers in various things, right? Skeptics is just it's an organization that's a scientific organization. We investigate claims of the paranormal and pseudoscience and fringe groups and cults. And this is our magazine, this quarterly publication of the society. When you join today for only $25, $5 off the regular price, you can get your latest issue, which just came out this last week. You can pick it up today. That way we don't have to mail it to you. So that brochure is floating around here. If you are not on our regular e-skeptic publication, weekly electronic publication, that's free. Go to skeptic.com and sign up for that. We just need your email address, or just give one of us staffers your email address and we'll sign up for you, so you can know what's going on in the upcoming months. So today is the last lecture of 05. Starting in 06, January 22nd, we have Jared Diamond, who is coming back, who gave us a full house. We'll be in Beckman Auditorium on that day. Beckman is the big white round building that holds about 1,000 people, because that's how many you need when Jared speaks. So Jared will be speaking on crisis management by people and nations, which is sort of a combination of guns, germs, and steel and collapse, and his next line of research that he's doing. Because he's become fairly well known, he does a lot of corporate and governmental consulting about good and bad decisions that people and organizations and nations make that cause them to succeed or fail. So he's going to do a nice lecture on that. Then Sunday, February 12th, which is Darwin's birthday, conveniently on a weekend this time, so we can have a little celebration for Darwin. Lisa Randall, the Harvard physicist, will be speaking. She's gotten a lot of press recently with her new book about, oh shoot, I forget the name of her book, Warped Parallel Universes, something like that. Anyway, she's a mathematical physicist and cosmologist who has a couple of the most cited papers in all of the physical sciences in the last decade. And so this is her first popular book, supposedly readable, but to the extent that any of these, well, it's as good as they come. It's just hard material. So she will translate it for us on February 12th. February 26th, Dan Dennett will be in town from Tufts University. Dan's on a book tour for his next book, which I just got a copy of recently. I'm reviewing for Science. It's called Breaking the Spell, The Evolutionary Origins of Religion. And I presume by breaking the spell, he means to change where that evolution has been going in terms of the power of religion. As you know, Dan's a Bright. You know what Brights are, right? It's a terrible name for a non-believer, but at any rate. I haven't booked anybody for March or May, but then April 9th, Tim Flannery, who is an Australian environmental scientist, has a book out called The Weather Makers, about global warming and everything humans have done to alter. Essentially, we are the weather makers now. We're creating the weather. Anyway, so he'll be in touring America, actually, for this book, and so we've got him coming through town on April 9th. If you want to go to Las Vegas, and who doesn't, this brochure, which you can pick up over there, is promoting the amazing meeting, James Randi's conference, at the Stardust Hotel, January 26th, 7th, 8th, and 9th. I'll be speaking. Murray Gelman, the amazing Randy, of course, Penn and Teller, Jamie and Swiss, Christopher Hitchens, Dan Dennett, the Mythbusters will be there. Oh, speaking of the Mythbusters, that's who's on the cover of our latest issue. These guys are the coolest, hottest skeptics going out there, mainly because they blow stuff up when they do science, and that's what's not to like about that. So Randy's really got a terrific lineup. It's incredible. 3.5 days essentially of all these really cool people just hanging around talking. So I do recommend, and you can go to randy.org and sign up there. You can pick up that brochure. Let's see. Oh, we do the $5 book table and lots of goodies over here, because this December 25th just happens to be the 363rd anniversary of Sir Isaac Newton's birthday. And a tradition has historically gathered momentum of exchanging gifts on Newton's birthday. So we're recommending science-related gifts, since it is Newton's birthday. And we have plenty of those here. All right, so it's true, December 25th. It's also true that it was the old calendar. So technically it's not really, as soon as I started doing this, I got letters from all these calendric calculators and science nerds saying, no, that's not right. It's like, it's just a shtick, okay? It's just, this isn't hardcore history of science here. Well, since it's, we're talking about evolution today. Oh, okay, one minor announcement in case you didn't notice. We have a different speaker today and a slightly different topic. My guy, David Buehler, who was going to lecture on evolutionary psych, couldn't make it. He was coming from Illinois, coming a long ways. Anyway, his tour got canceled, so he's not here. But since he was going to lecture on evolutionary psychology, so I figured since half of Americans don't even believe in evolution at all, maybe we should cover that subject before we get into the details of where you apply it if you don't even believe in it. So not that this audience is going to be in that same demographic, but nevertheless, it doesn't hurt to know, even if you accept evolution, believe in evolution is not even, I have to quit saying that. It's not even the right way to say it. You don't, it's like, it's not a belief system. It's like I believe in gravity. Well, we either accept it as fact, it happened, or you don't, and half of all Americans don't. So those of us who do, of course, it's good to have the intellectual ammunition for that. Anyway, before I introduce Don, our speaker, the Darwin Awards were just given out. As you know, the Darwin Awards are given out to people who do really stupid things and remove themselves from the gene pool. Here are just a few of the 10 I thought were the most interesting. Seems an Arkansas guy wanted some beer pretty badly. He decided that he'd just throw a cinder block through a liquor store window, grab some booze, and run. So he lifted the cinder block and heaved it over his head at the window. The cinder block bounced back and hit the would-be thief on the head, knocking him unconscious. The liquor store window was made of plexiglass. As a female shopper exited a New York convenience store, a man grabbed her purse and ran. The clerk called 911 immediately, and the woman was able to give them a detailed description of the purse snatcher. Within minutes, the police apprehended him. They put him in the car and drove him back to the store. The thief was then taken out of the car and told to stand there for a positive ID, to which he replied, "Yes, officer, that's her. That's the lady I stole the purse from." A man walked into a Louisiana Circle K, put a $20 bill on the counter, and asked for change. When the clerk opened the cash drawer, the man pulled a gun and asked for all the cash in the register, which the clerk promptly provided. The man took the cash from the clerk and fled, leaving the $20 bill on the counter. The total amount of cash he got from the drawer, $15. He's doing the new math. After stopping for drinks, it is Christmas time, Newton this time. After stopping for drinks at an illegal bar, a Zimbabwean bus driver found that the 20 mental patients he was supposed to be transporting had escaped. Not wanting to admit his incompetence, the driver went to a nearby bus stop and offered everyone waiting there a free ride. He then delivered the passengers to the mental hospital, telling the staff there that the patients were very excitable and prone to bizarre fantasies. And finally, the #1 winner of the Darwin Award for 2005, when a .38 caliber revolver failed to fire at his intended victim during a holdup in Long Beach, California, would-be robber James Elliott did something that can only inspire wonder. He peered down the barrel and tried the trigger again. He is now a member of the Darwin Club. I have no idea if these things are true or not. I think half of them are just internet stuff. But what the heck, it's fun. All right, so evolution. How do we know it happened and why does it matter? Wow. The latest issue of Natural History magazine, in fact, is devoted, the entire issue is devoted to this very subject. And it's not so much, here's the debate about intelligent design and evolution. It's really about evolution. It's a rigorous and deep science, and one of the key authors there is Donald Prothero, our speaker today. We've known Don a long time. He's on the board of Skeptic magazine. He's been lecturing for us. He gave his first lecture for us, I think in '93 or '94. He also spoke at the Gould Festschrift that we did in tribute to Stephen Jay Gould in 2000. Don is a professor of geology at Occidental College in LA. He's a lecturer here in geobiology at Caltech. He earned his master's and PhD degrees from the geological sciences at Columbia University. He got a bachelor's in geology at University of California, Riverside. He likes rocks. He's currently the author, co-author, excuse me, editor or co-editor of 21 different books and about 200 scientific papers, including 5 leading geology textbooks and 3 trade books, as well as an edited symposium volume and other technical works. In addition to being on the editorial board of Skeptic, he's on the editorial board of Geology magazine, as well as Paleobiology and the Journal of Paleontology. He's a fellow of the Geological Society of America, the Paleontological Society, the Linnaean Society of London, which is really cool. And he's also received fellowships and grants from the Guggenheim Foundation and the National Science Foundation. In 1991, he received the Schuchert Award from the Paleontological Society, which is the award given to the most outstanding paleontologist under the age of 40. Stephen Jay Gould, for example, won that award. He's also been featured, I'm sure if you're channel surfing around the various cable channels where you see the dinosaur shows, you've seen Don on there. He's been on Paleo World a number of times, walking with prehistoric beasts. You see him as a talking head, expert on evolutionary biology and geology and the fossil record and so on. Never on Jerry Springer, though, that I know of, right? Right. So with that, please help me welcome Dr. Donald Prothero. Okay, you're good to go.
Now, are we going to be able to get the lights down on the screen here so it'll be a little darker? Okay, I'll move around here so I won't stand in your way much. For those of you out in the wings, you may find this is as big as we can get the screen, so this is the best I can do. I tried not to make too much small images or small type. I got an email from Michael about 5 days ago saying, our speaker's canceled. Can you put something together? So luckily I've done this enough times and I'm familiar with the material enough that I put in a few late nights, which the babies keep me up anyway, so it's not a big deal to do that. And so I threw this together based on stuff I've done over the years, and my slideshow is now obsolete anyway, so it's all PowerPoint these days, as most of you know. As many of you know, of course, the topic of evolution has always been a hot one in the United States, more so than any other country. And once again, we find ourselves embattled and under attack, and on the cover of Time magazine, which is always a sign something's happening. And of course, it's an interesting sort of series of historical twists we're talking about here, because, of course, it certainly was controversial in 1859 when Darwin's book came out. But by the time Darwin died in 1882, it was essentially accepted by virtually all educated Westerners in almost all countries, including the US, although less so here than in other European countries. And then there was backlash, of course, during the 1890s up through 1920s when the fundamentalist movement first arose, culminating, of course, in the 1925 Scopes monkey trial, which sort of put fundamentalism and creationism in bad light, but surprisingly did nothing to change the laws that it was actually intended to change. It really wasn't until the 1950s, in fact 1957 especially, when the year Sputnik went above us, which many in this room are old enough to remember, that suddenly the US realized it had been letting science languish in its curriculum so long and forced us to suddenly throw out a lot of this garbage that we've been teaching and get our science up to speed. At the same time, of course, we went through some conservative waves, especially in the 1970s and 1980s, and the creationist movement, which had been around since the 1890s, sort of re-arose for a while, but finally met the last legal Waterloo, if you will, in 1982 when Federal Superior Court essentially pointed out that everything they do is religion, it's not science, it doesn't belong in a science classroom according to the Constitution. So that should have been the end of the story right there, but as you know, it was not. They kept pushing their cases in places that don't follow federal law too well, like local school boards and places like that where they have more power and more influence. And then in recent years, they have their own new stealth strategy to get themselves back into the curriculum, the so-called intelligent design creationism, which is why that time cover was out. I just heard Michael give a talk on this a few weeks ago, and I'm sure he'll probably talk about it pretty soon when his new book comes out on it. So I won't say too much about it here. I'll just say a few things. Intelligent design, for those you know something about it, it's basically an old argument recycled. These various mostly non-paleontologists and fringe scientists start out with religious viewpoints, and then they want to essentially make their viewpoints sound scientific. So they're arguing, for example, nature bears signs of irreducible complexity that cannot evolve by quote-unquote random chance, requires intelligent designer, and they claim their ideas do not require Judeo-Christian God, that they're not some sort of ruse to get religion into the curriculum, that they're not promoting religious belief. Of course, they know they have to say that because the courts throw them out if they don't. But you can find smoking guns very easily if you look just behind the surface of what they say to what they've said in places where they're not realizing when they're being quoted. Dembski, for example, one of their main spokespersons here, and I got this from Michael's book, in a conference right out here in Anaheim, says, intelligent design opens the whole possibility of us being created in the image of benevolent God. The job of apologetics is to clear the ground, to clear obstacles, to prevent people from coming to the knowledge of Christ. If there's anything I think that has blocked the growth of Christ is the free reign of the Spirit and people accepting Scripture in Jesus Christ is the Darwinian naturalistic view. Well, there's a more obvious smoking gun than that. I can't imagine it. Philip Johnson, a lawyer at Berkeley who has no scientific training, is one of their main spokespeople. He says, the objective is to convince people that Darwinism is inherently atheistic. Of course, that's the standard way they do this. Thus shifting the debate from creationism versus evolution, the existence of God versus non-existence of God, which of course creationists have done for years. From there, the people are introduced to the quote-unquote truth of the Bible and then quote-unquote question of sin and finally quote-unquote introduced to Jesus. So it's very blatantly religious, it just doesn't say so when the people are listening. But they are, in fact, clearly religious. There's this little cartoon from recent editorial things. Literally, the wolves in sheep's clothing there, creationism with the sheep's clothing of intelligent design, and of course, the religious right riding that into the public schools, and our scientists here saying, warn the neighbors, the carnival's back in town. And of course, the ultimate goal is to get around what federal courts and the Supreme Courts have repeatedly ruled, which is you cannot teach any specific religious dogma in public schools, especially not in a science class. Constitution forbids that. Of course, it crosses the line between separation of church and state. So what we end up having is these various interesting voodoo science being taught as real science. As you see, the teacher here, for those who can't read in the back, says, and now class, your new science teacher with the voodoo mask here will explain intelligent design. Now, of course, for those of you who know a little bit about the history of philosophy and the history of science, know intelligent design is nothing new. It's just a label, a new label on an old wine bottle, right? It's been around a long time. It goes back at least as far as the Greeks and the Romans, talking about beautifully designed things, and of course inferring their gods designed those things, not the Judeo-Christian God, obviously. Cicero was no Christian, obviously. But of course, people like Thomas Aquinas certainly put that kind of argument in their things. That was something that was very popular with medieval theologians as well. For those you know, though, that the main historical opponent and the person whose name is most associated with this idea is a famous natural theologian, what was then the natural scientist at the time, by the name of William Paley, who was also, of course, a doctor of divinity as well. Famous book called Natural Theology, which was actually one of Darwin's favorite books when he was a young man, and many of his contemporaries as well. And his famous analogy here, he talked about if you walked on a beach and you saw a stone, you wouldn't make any big fuss about that being something that's intricately designed by a supernatural designer. But if you found a watch on a beach, you would argue that it had some kind of intelligent designer for this contrivance. And that would be the watch, a divine watchmaker, which of course, in their minds at that time was the Judeo-Christian deity. Okay? Now, ironically, that argument had already been discredited, but it didn't matter. Okay? Those of you know your philosophy, David Hume, who was one of the most far-seeing philosophers of his time, one of the great Scottish Enlightenment philosophers, in 1779, Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, had an extensive dialogue where he tore this argument to shreds. And points out, of course, natural theology doesn't automatically lead to Judeo-Christian God. Of course, that was just the assumption of the British of that time. If it's divine, therefore it must be their God. Okay? It could be a God from any other culture. It could be a committee of gods, or maybe a juvenile God who made a few mistakes. Okay? And Hume does this in a dialogue format, so you don't really have him actually saying in his own words. He puts in the words of his characters. Okay, now you can, if you want to look at nature, find plenty of beautiful, intricately, exquisitely designed looking things. Like this is a shell of radiolarian, and there's a blow up of the intricate structure of these things. There's plenty of these in nature. That's not a problem. This is the Euplectella, the Venus's flower basket sponge, with all the intricate little weaving of the glass rods. The close-up of the compound eye, or the intricate design of a honeycomb. This all sounds like it's intricately designed by a creator, but of course those last two are really actually functions of putting together close packed spheres or close packed cylinders. That's how you get hexagonal close packing like honeycomb. Okay, but the trade-off, of course, being, hang on here, that if you go by that argument, intelligent design is responsible for all these beautiful things, you must also then go to get the bad with the good, which is nature has lots of things which are not so beautiful and not so well designed. Okay? And these are Stephen Jay Gould's favorite examples. This is a clam called Lampsilis, a freshwater clam. It actually makes a brood pouch that looks like a very poorly designed fish, designed to make real fish bite on that and take the larvae into their gills, and that's how the clam's larvae get from one generation to the next. Okay, now that's not a very good fish by anybody's standards, okay, but it's just good enough for an average freshwater fish with relatively poor vision and was following the motion anyway to take a bite, okay? Or this example from, we have sound here, I didn't know we were going to have that. This is the anglerfish that you see is very nicely camouflaged and then has a spine over its nose which it wiggles out there in the water, and the spine has a frayed edge which looks roughly like a fish. Lures a prey item close enough to try to take a bite of that, and then it opens its mouth and sucks the prey in. Okay? Not a great fish lure, but just good enough. Okay? And as we screeching tires here, of course, this was Gould's favorite example, the panda's thumb. Pandas, of course, like all carnivorous mammals, like your cat or your dog, all 5 of their hand fingers are fused together in a paw, okay, like any other thing, and yet they have what appears to be a 6th finger. There's actually an extra wrist bone, which is used because pandas are the only carnivore that eats plants, of course, they eat bamboo, and they use that jury-rigged wrist bone to strip leaves off of bamboo. It doesn't work really well like a true thumb, it just has worked just well enough for them to survive, which is the way evolution works in general. Oops. And of course, if you want to explain design, you have to deal with issues like the fact that there are lots of evidence of things that look sloppily designed, if you want to think that way. Of course, they make lots of sense in evolutionary context. Vestigial organs, of course, they clearly scream out evolution and make no sense in the sense of a designer who we want to divinely put things together. Of course, whales, of course, still have this, and I'll show you this in a moment again, hip bones and thigh bones deep inside their bodies, even though they no longer have hind legs on the outside. Snakes, too, have hip bones and thigh bones deep inside their bodies, and they no longer have their limbs. And, of course, horses still have remnants of their side toes. Okay? All of which make no sense if you're trying to design something in the right way the first time. And, of course, humans, as much as we like to think of ourselves as the pinnacle of creation, are classic examples of poor design, if you want to think of us as design the way we are now. Of course, it makes more sense that we evolved in something that was different originally. Our backs and our feet, of course, our poor little hominid there with back pain, are not meant for bipedalism, as many of us in this room can tell you. Our appendix and tonsils, of course, are vestigial organs, no longer have any function, but they are prone to infection, so they're actually deleterious to a lesser degree, and yet we still have them. And you can ask yourself, if you're an intelligent designer, why do males have nipples? Okay? Just give that thought a little minute. All right. But the even bigger problem with the design argument, is one that goes back to almost all of apologetics in Christianity, is that there are many examples of cruelty and evilness in nature, if we define nature by human terms. Does this imply that the God that created it is cruel or evil, or it just doesn't care? Okay? It applies not only to well-known examples, the ones that make Christian apologetics always have to thrash around a lot, things like innocent children dying horribly and natural disasters killing innocent people, but also natural systems. And a classic example of this is a whole family of wasps. There's 3,300 different species of them that do this. They're known as ichthyomonid wasps, and they have a very interesting way of reproducing. They find a prey item, the female stabs it with her ovipositor and paralyzes it, lays eggs inside the body of the prey item, and then the larvae, the eggs hatch the larvae and start eating the prey from the inside with the less essential organs first, and leave the essential organs to the very end. So the prey is essentially eaten alive from the inside. And finally, they eat the last organs that are still essential, which kills the prey item finally, and then they hatch out of the prey item's body. Okay? The Victorians of Darwin's time were horrified by this. All right? They were all believers in God's beneficence and benevolence, you know, and how he could never let a sparrow die, and that, of course, more of this was documented, the more it made them have serious problems about their religion. Okay? But this is one of many examples of nature's, no, not necessarily cruel or friendly, it's just nature. Okay? Now, the bigger issue I want to focus this whole talk, that's all I'm going to say about ID from now on, because that's in Michael's book anyway, which is due out. I want to focus mostly on the fossil record, which is my area of expertise. I've been a paleontologist since age 4 and never grew up. So I will focus on the fossil record, which I do have expertise on, and this is something that I can definitely debate them on any time. Both the young Earth creationists here, which I abbreviate YECs, the old-fashioned type of creationists like Gish and Henry Morris and so on, and the ID crowd both have to try to debunk evolution, and they have to definitely say something about the fossil record. They can't leave it alone, obviously. So they, as I'll show you through this whole lecture, they repeat lots of old discredited lies and propaganda about the fossil record. And the big issue here, of course, is credibility. They say something about the fossil record. Why are you to believe them or not believe them? The issue is credibility. How are they doing this? Well, first of all, none of these guys, either the newer or the old generation creationists, has any formal training in paleontology. There's not a single one that I know of, except maybe that one guy in Tennessee who was one of Gould's students once. They're all basically trained in other areas, most of which have nothing to do with fossils. Okay? Many of them may have a PhD, but as those of you in this room who have a PhD knows, that proves nothing. It only, right? It only proves that you can do one task, which is your thesis, and finish it, right? And the old joke in graduate school is you get narrower and narrower and narrower and know less and less about the rest of the world as you get further into your dissertation. So, you know, if you have a PhD in hydraulics, it means that it does not mean anything about your credibility as a physicist or a paleontologist or anything else. But when they throw their PhDs on the cover of their books, you know, it impresses the unwashed, and they think, ah, well, they must know something. They have a PhD. That's usually my first red flag, by the way. You see anybody put their doctorate on the cover of their book, and that's usually a sign the arguments inside can't stand by themselves. Okay? I never have that on my book, even though I'm entitled to it. Okay? Now, as most of you know who follow them, their research, quote unquote, on fossils consists of reading kiddie books, and maybe a few more advanced trade books, and quoting paleontologists out of context. They never actually have looked at real fossils themselves, certainly never done any research. As far as I know, not one paleontological paper has ever been published by this group. Okay? And that's a criterion for credibility. You have to actually publish in peer-reviewed journals. You can't just write out of kiddie books. Okay? So in my terms, you can say any way you like, but they're no more qualified to write about fossils than they are about anything else. Auto mechanics, you name it, right? They're just blowing it out the ass. Okay. So these are two of the more typical tracks. This is the old Earth version from Duane Gish, and this is the more recent sort of de-religified version, which they use for trying to push their agenda on school boards. They're both examples, essentially, of taking old, discredited ideas about the fossil record, which I'll go through them in detail now, and repeating them over and over again, even though they've been all discredited multiple times. And, of course, they never listen to criticism, so they don't realize this. Okay, here's a quick list. I'll just go over some of these in greater detail, some in less detail. This is the commonest things you find them misinterpreting and or lying about, and I will just use the flat-out word lying about because that's what they do, and they know they're doing it too. The fossil record, okay? This confusion between bushes and ladders, which I'll talk about first. Their misuse of the famous concepts of gradualism versus punctuated equilibrium. The idea that faunal succession is not, in fact, support for the fossil record, which they manage to push once in a while. Or they argue, well, the fossil record's great, it's good enough to show every transitional form. So they try to have both sides of the argument here, usually. This business about the Cambrian explosion, which I'll show you in a moment here. And then they're flat out claim that there are no transitional forms. Well, that's only possible if you've never looked at a fossil, okay? And finally, there's never been, the mislink has never been found. All these are typical of the claims they make. So let's look at them one after another here, and I'll spend more time on some of these. The first problem is this idea that it's hard for us in evolutionary biology to get used to people actually thinking this way, but there are people out there, lots of them, who think this way. And this is the idea that nature is this great ladder of creation. This goes back to Aristotelian thought and was very much prevalent in pre-Darwinian philosophy. And it was essentially blown out of the water by Darwin, but of course it still persists. This idea that we're just part of the great chain of being, going from lower things to higher things, and of course supernatural things like angels and archangels and seraphim and cherubim and all the rest we sing about this time of year are all higher on the ladder than us, okay? And this is, of course, a nice little medieval notion. It has nothing to do with nature, okay? It's not a ladder, it's a bush, and Gould has said this many, many times. Evolution is about branching, about multiple lineages appearing and disappearing and coexisting. There is no such thing as this ladder of the great chain of being that was thought about in pre-Darwinian things. But nevertheless, you'll see creationists saying these very strange things like, if humans evolved from apes, how come apes are still around? And you scratch your head and say, what the hell do they mean by that? Until you realize that's what they're thinking. They're thinking that apes had to give up their place on the world to humans in order for humans to evolve. The apes cannot coexist with humans. And so that's such a bizarre way of thinking that it's hard for you to even conceive of it, but that is still something you'll hear people say. And this is not a very old cartoon here. The two characters from Johnny Hart's BC, who was a very conservative religious guy, by the way, said, if man evolved from the apes, how come there were still apes around? And the other guy says, some of them were given choices. Okay. So evolution is not this very simplistic notion, like here's the old-fashioned, century-old now diagram of evolution of horses, a straight lineage through time. Well, that was appropriate a century ago when there weren't many fossils. But of course, we now have a huge diversity of horse fossils, and they are very complexly branching, and there are many different bushes here. And by the way, at the end of the lecture here, I brought out a bunch of specimens. I've got a bunch of horses and ancestors of horses here on the table if anyone wants to see what these look like. The casts are mostly, there's a couple of real specimens here. The casts show you how big these things are and what they look like. Oh yeah, sound effects there. All right, and you'll see this iconography all the time, which of course is also invalid and long ago discredited. This march through the human evolution, or march through hominids. Again, this is an unfortunate early way of drawing human evolution, a single line rather than a bush or a branch. And then you get various takeoffs on this icon here. So here's a creationist here. The Earth is 6,000 years old, and he's standing in the middle between what, Homo erectus and Neanderthal. And then here's another version going down to the computer age. There at the end of that line of evolution. I've had another one, which I didn't find a copy of to scan, where it culminates in Sylvester Stallone dressed as Rambo. This icon is so familiar that if you've ever seen Stephen Jay Gould's Wonderful Life, the book he published about 15 years ago, he's like 25 examples of this in the front of the book. But of course, it's completely incorrect, right? Human evolution is just as bushy as any other species on Earth or any other family on Earth. This is the evolution of the hominids, our family, and there's about 26 recognized hominid species out there besides ourselves in 6 or 7 genera now. And I'll show you more about this in a moment. And so that's all, the problem there. They start out with the wrong iconography, you get the wrong conception. And of course, there's chimps and there's gorillas. They run parallel to this all along. They're still around, obviously. Okay. Our second widespread misconception is, of course, a typical case where something that was a normal debate within scientific circles is taken completely out of context by creationists. And this, of course, is the big debate that originated in 1972 when Stephen Jay Gould, when he was a young man, fresh out of graduate school, and Niles Eldridge, who was one of my graduate advisors at Columbia, pointed out that the fossil record doesn't show what people had, and Darwin included, had said it should show, this gradual, insensibly graded series. And these are frequency histograms of a different organism through time. And you see time goes along the axis there. There's not many examples of that in the fossil record. We don't see that. And there's a good reason for that. And Gould and Eldridge pointed this out. Actually, it should have been pointed out 20 years earlier. But it was Gould and Eldridge who finally did this. And that is, in the 1950s, biology went through a big change where they recognized that species are produced by small isolated populations on the periphery of the main range of the population, not in the main population. And that's called the allopatric speciation model. It had pretty much been accepted by biologists ever since the 1950s. And if you think about the predictions of that, that means that populations like that are small. They'll produce a species and then maybe migrate back to the main area. And you will only get new species appearing suddenly as a result, especially in the geologic record. You will not see that transition unless you're extremely lucky. Okay? And so most species will appear relatively suddenly in the fossil record, and then they appear to have long periods of stability or stasis that follow that. And all this was something that at first was a shock to paleontologists who unfortunately had not paid attention to what biologists have been saying for 20 years. But then within about 10 years, it's been realized that virtually all fossil record looks like this. There's some exceptions, but generally speaking, most fossils show punctuated equilibrium if they show anything at all. Okay? Now, when they made that argument, of course, they argued the transition between species to be rare, but not absent, right? They wouldn't have, completely absent. But of course, you can pick up any of those creationist books I just showed you, and they will find a quotation out of Eldridge and Gould, quoted out of context to indicate that there are no transitions, which of course at no time did Eldridge or Gould ever say that or mean to say that, of course, but that's a typical creationist tactic. Quote things out of context, don't do your own research, obviously. And what a lot of times when we talk about transitional forms, we're not talking about every single specimen leads to a new species. That's a hard thing to get under any circumstances. Where you can look at a series of species that are static through time, they form transitional series too. And so you don't have to have the actual specimen that's ancestral to something else to see a transition. Okay, so this is a very widespread misconception. You'll see these in their literature all the time. Okay, point number 3. The creationists cannot abide with the idea that the rock record shows a change in life through time. Obviously, if it's all dropped there by Noah's flood, it can't show that. So they have to have some kind of explanation for it. And they do it 2 ways, which are self-contradictory. One way is a straight denial. Claim that the fossil record doesn't show evolution. They claim that evolutionists have rigged it. right? That we arrange the fossils in the order that we want by the strata, and that essentially is a circular argument. They were saying, the fossils show change through time, but we did it that way all along, of course, and therefore that's our proof of evolution. Well, no, and I'll show you in a moment why that's wrong. Or the exact opposite argument to concede that the fossil record shows change through time, and then they had this ridiculous little argument claiming that smarter animals climbed to higher ground during the Great Flood. Okay, well, let's look at both of those arguments. The first one, here is a geologic timescale that predates Darwin by at least 30 years, okay, ignores history. Okay, because the time scale that we now have goes back to 50 years before Darwin. Okay, it was worked out by creationist geologists in 1800 to 1805. Okay, evolution was never in the equation. It's an empirical distribution of fossils through time. You don't need to have evolution or any other causal mechanism to explain it. It's the basis for all of the dating of rocks around the world, and it's done without evolution ever driving it in the first place, because evolution wasn't around when it was created. Okay. And it's been verified by thousands of geologists, and including some who are creationist geologists and have come to admit that, in fact, it does look this way. It's an empirical distribution. You can find it in the rock record if you want to look for it yourself. And, of course, without it, we would never find any oil or gas. It's the main tool that we use to tell how old the rocks are in order to drill for oil. Okay? So they can get rid of faunal succession, but then they have to get rid of oil and gas, too. All right, or the other argument, of course, which comes from their flood geology models, this idea that somehow smarter animals outran Noah's flood and climbed to higher beds, and that's why you have mammals at the top and dinosaurs below and the lowly invertebrates at the bottom. Well, of course, that's crap too. All right, this is the old hydraulic sorting that came from Henry Morris, who may have been an engineer but not a very good scientist. It only makes sense if you want to try to explain a cartoon. Okay, this is a typical cartoon of the geologic timescale from a kiddie book. Right? And that's an abstraction, right? That's something they use to make a general point. It doesn't look like any real spot on Earth, right? And yet you're trying to make a flood model that explains a cartoon rather than a real place on Earth, or real rocks, okay? And it bears, as I said, no resemblance to real rock record on which this is based. I mean, you want to look at real rocks, go to places like, for example, the Grand Canyon, Zion, and Bryce, and yes, you will get a sequence here where you can patch together the lower part of the sequence in the Grand Canyon, the middle part at Zion, and the upper part at Bryce, but even that's not that complete. In most cases, it's much less complete than this. And of course, in no way does this resemble something that's produced by a single Noah's flood. Okay? A more typical example where I did my dissertation work in the Big Badlands, South Dakota, one of the most richly fossiliferous places in the world. Here is distribution of some of the more important animals through these beds. And sure enough, well, here's some large and smart and long-legged animals that are way at the bottom, and here's turtles above them. Okay, now if you can argue how a turtle outran the flood and a large brontosaurus did not, I'll give you a lot of credit. Okay? So basically, of course, it's all crap. This is just an attempt to push their biblical models on something they don't understand. And so this version of creationism is full of holes. All right. Another argument you'll hear them make, because it's very strange. One moment they're trying to discredit the fossil record, next minute they're telling you to say it's so good it shows something else. So you can't have consistency out of them at all. Creationists will hear them argue there's millions of fossil museum cabinets, which is true. The fossil record should be very complete and should show every transitional form between species. Okay, well, not necessarily. Actually, despite 200 years of collecting, and I'll show you in a moment why, the fossil record is not that complete. For many things, it's very poor. There's a lot more out there than we realize. Okay, and of course, that's because fossilization is an extremely improbable event, right? You have to have the organism die. It has to avoid being too scavenged, be buried at the appropriate time and not decay away completely. And then after a long period of burial, it has to be exposed to the surface again at just the right time. So in the last 200 years, a paleontologist walked by and saw it. Okay? Otherwise, it's lost to history. Okay? And this little cartoon says it quite nicely. If you imagine, let's say, your antelope out in the African Serengeti that dies, well, of course, most often it's torn apart by scavengers, so very little is left. But if there's anything left, it's trampled by other animals, and then it's buried, and then all sorts of stuff happens. The soil will break up the bones, and then groundwater works on it. So there's all this stuff going on to a thing that potentially become fossil. So at the end, and then when it's finally exposed again and eroded, it's got to happen when a paleontologist happens to be there to see it, or it doesn't get collected. Okay? So you think about it, it's a miracle, no pun intended, that any bone or shell ever becomes a fossil. It's a very improbable event if you think about it a priori like this. Okay? Let's get some quantitative handle on that. We can talk about it. We have about 250,000 known fossil species. That's all animals and plants together. Okay? Yet at this very moment, there's at least 5 million species on Earth today, and some people say as great as 20 million, depends on how you do the estimate. And then if you add our modern time slice and back it up for all the time slices back to 600 million years, you come up to gigantic numbers of how many millions of species must have lived over the last 600 million years. Okay? So no matter how you do that calculation, the very best you can get is less than 1% of all the species that ever lived are how represented in the fossil record. Okay? And that's nothing like creationists would give you to think. Now, of course, not every group is equally bad. Things that have well-developed skeletons like mollusks and corals are much more likely to fossilize than are, let's say, insects or worms, which have a crappy fossil record, of course. So when we do something with a fossil record, we do it deliberately with groups that have good preservation, but still maybe only 10 or 20% of all species that ever lived in the best records are fossilized. So that creationist argument that we should expect to see everything is crap. All right. Now, I hope you don't mind calling a spade here, but I think this audience understands. This is one that's constantly, in fact, I was with Michael on radio at KPCC about a year and a half ago when an ID guy was on the channel, and he brought this out, and I thought, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Why would he bring this out? But this is something they keep bringing up simply because it sounds good to an audience that doesn't know any better, okay? Back in Darwin's time, we were talking 150 years ago then, it was a great mystery why trilobites and sponges and brachiopods and all these other things that show up in the Cambrian appeared at that time to show up all at once. And it was called the Cambrian explosion not long after that. And you'll hear creationists claim this Cambrian explosion is inexplicable by natural explanations and requires it to become one of the creation events mentioned in the Bible. Of course, not consistent at all with the Bible, but that's another point. All right, but of course that shows that they don't do any homework. We've learned a lot more about the Cambrian in the last 40 years. That's nothing which, of course, enters their literature. And it actually enters the literature in very prominent ways. I mean, cover of Time magazine, you can't miss something like that. Evolution's Big Bang, which of course was nice, it was evolutionary, but it has some misleading things, as you see in the caption on the title here. Talks about almost overnight. Well, 20 million years is not overnight by many people's standards. Even geologists don't consider 20 million years overnight, but that's what Time magazine often does too. Now, in fact, this is what the fossil record really does look like. Contrary creationists will make the claim. This is my friend Bill Schaaf's pictures over UCLA. We have abundant fossils prior to the Cambrian, but until the 1940s, nobody saw them because they didn't look the right way. You have to look with a microscope. They're all cyanobacteria. They're all little microscopic single-celled things. And you have to have very good microscopes to see these things, okay? And from 3.5 billion years ago, we have these cyanobacteria, what used to be called blue-green algae. They have living relatives which are virtually indistinguishable from these fossils, okay? And then from 3.5 billion to almost 0.5 billion, in other words, 3 billion years of life's history, there was nothing more complex on this planet than single-celled algae and bacteria, okay? 90% of life's history, we were the planet of the scum, okay? In other words, this is if you see a structure that's big enough to see with the naked eye, it's these mound-like structures made of cyanobacterial mats called stromatolites. That's the biggest thing you find in the fossil record until about 700 million years ago. Okay? So if an alien landed on this planet any time in this last 4 billion years and wanted to take a sample of life, odds are this is all there was to see. Because it's a very, very late phenomenon in all these advanced plants and animals that are multicellular. We're just the last gasp, the last 10% of Earth history. Now, in that last 10%, of course, things happen pretty fast, relatively speaking, geologically speaking. So the first stage after single-cell organisms are these so-called Ediacaran fauna. These things are known from about 700 million years ago, the late Precambrian. Multicellular, but all soft body. We only have impressions. We don't have skeletons. And these things are debated as to what they really are, whether they're related to, say, modern corals and sponges or whatever. Whatever they are, they're animals, they're multicellular, and they're large enough to see with the naked eye. In fact, some of these things are 1.5 feet long. But no skeletons yet. Okay, so that's the first thing. You start with single cells, you get multi-cells, but no skeletons. And then the very beginning of the Cambrian, before trilobites arose, you see the classic what's called the Tomatian little shelly fauna. These are all about a couple millimeters long. Now, some things look like mollusks, some things look like other groups we recognize, some don't look like anything we've seen before. And so when you start seeing skeletonized fossils, they're tiny. All right, skeletonization is a big step, and they make very tiny amounts of mineral when they first start making skeletons. Okay? And it was not until the third stage of the Cambrian, the Adiabanian there, that trilobites and some of these larger multicellular skeletonized animals appear, and that's when you get the Cambrian explosion. So there are actually multiple steps which are very logical, and here's the so-called Cambrian explosion, diversity increasing to the right there. That window is about 20 million years long. So it's not an instantaneous event, contrary to what the creationists may have told you. And of course, Some of you have heard this, of course. Stephen Jay Gould's book, Wonderful Life, was on this topic. In the middle Cambrian, we have an extraordinary window on life in that period of time, where you have soft preservation, these things that normally don't fossilize. And we see all these bizarre animals like hallucigenia there and opabinia, which remind us, again, how incomplete our fossil record is. The soft body preservation is a rare event and only occurs in a handful of places that we know in the entire fossil record. And there's tons of stuff we know must have existed, but we'll never see as a fossil. Okay, now this is the meat of what I want to talk about here, and I'll spend most of my time on this topic. This is where they obviously have to do something, because they can't leave this one alone or they'll not take any, will not be believed. They have to argue flat out, denial, it's like denying the Holocaust. They have to deny the transitional form, right? And they don't have any first-hand experience with any fossils, so this is all done strictly by blind faith, okay? And so there are various ways they go about doing this. The Eldridge and Gould, of course, said, of course, the transitions will be rare, but they do occur, and of course, I'll show you some of those. In addition, there are many examples where you have, fossil species that are stable and, of course, have already undergone their evolution to represent what they are now. But if you stack them in a sequence, as they are in the rock record, they still represent transitions from one stage to another. That hasn't been ruled out, okay? But instead, as we'll see, and I'll talk about this examples multiple times here, the creationists pretty much deny what's out there. They have to print some kind of outright lie or just quote out of context in order to deny existence of fossils that are well documented by anybody who spent the time actually looking at real fossils rather than reading kiddie books. Now, this goes at every level you can name. Okay? When I was a graduate student, I spent a fair amount of time working in micropaleontology, deep sea cores. You can see amazing transformations. This is a group called the planktonic foraminifera. This is a group called the radiolaria here, and you go up through the core centimeter by centimeter, and you can see these microfossils change centimeter by centimeter. They're really dramatic. I mean, think it was a big spongy ball of silica initially, then 4 arms and 3 arms and 2 arms, and then it gets narrower and narrower, and then it starts becoming this big sort of spongy capsule. I mean, that's a complete multiple rearrangement of the body form through that time of evolution. And to me, that's dramatic, although creationists, of course, don't care about anything that small, all right? Or this simple sort of bulbous forearm going here to something that's very sharply keeled step by step. Okay, so microfossils are full of that, okay? If you look at the invertebrate fossil record, where you have tons better preservation, many more fossils than we do invertebrates, there are many classic cases. This is a famous Eocene snail from the Gulf Coast, Athleta, which changes dramatically through the sequence. This is the evolution of a variety of trilobites in the Cambrian and Wales. And this is the evolution of horseshoe crabs from a group called the Aglaspids, and you can see the steps all along the way. Okay, all of this is well documented. The creationists never talk about these things, of course. Or if you like sand dollars and sea urchins, well, sea urchins in the Cretaceous chalks of Britain have this dramatic transformation of micraster where the mouth and anus shift position as you go up through the sequence. Or here we go, the earliest sand dollars arise from a fairly biscuit-shaped sea urchin, but by the early Eocene we have these flat sand dollars. We can see these intermediate steps of flatter and flatter sea urchins until you get to sand dollars. Okay, all this is, there's many more examples I can provide. These are the ones I happen to have convenient pictures of. Or the ammonoids, of course, the most common of all fossils in the Mesozoic and late Paleozoic. They have many very bizarre things that go on in their evolution, including coiling up and then uncoiling again, coiling in spirals, coiling in knots, coiling in hairpin bends. They do weird things. They're very flexible, and their evolution is very well documented because they fossilize well. Okay, but those are all examples of changes within a major lineage or within a species in a couple of cases. What about transition between the major phylum invertebrates? And people have always argued, well, that's, we'll concede these microevolutionary changes in your ammonites, but what about how do you get from an arthropod to an annelid or something like that? And so this is a little more difficult because we're talking about groups that go back to the Cambrian, and then most of them are not skeletonized before then. They were probably soft-bodied, so you don't get too many fossils of that transition, although we know the relationships quite well because it's shown both by their anatomy and now, of course, by their molecular phylogeny. But there are some. Okay, this was a famous discovery in 1952, a little cap-shaped shell found in the Peru-Chile Trench off the coast of Peru in deep water. It's called Neopalaena. Well, that's because the original fossil was found the first time was called Palaena, and so they actually knew the fossil before they knew the living fossil. And this is a mollusk, no question about it. It's got a mantle, it's got all the other things, a foot and everything, but it also has segmentation, the only mollusk that's segmented. Okay, it's still got segmented gills and segmented muscles, which says very loud and clear that, of course, mollusks arose, and that's now verified by molecular phylogeny from a common ancestor with segmented worms. And likewise, this has often been pointed to, although there's dispute about this one, the velvet worms, the Onychophora, Peripatus is a common name for this thing, although they don't live around here, they live in the tropics. They look a lot of like a segmented worm, but they also have beginnings of jointed appendages with hard cuticle, like an arthropod. And so they have often been pointed to as sort of a link between those two phyla. And they are actually known from the fossil record, especially back in the Burgess Shale. But as you might guess, creationists and their followers don't know one fossil shell from another. Couldn't care less anyway, right? So show them invertebrates up to wazoo. It won't impress them. They're not really interested, okay? So you got to focus on our group, the vertebrates, right? That's what they care about to some degree. And of course, that too is well documented. This is a diagram that's almost a century old now. It's a well-documented sequence. Actually, we have some of these transitional forms living today that are sort of halfway on the way to being vertebrates, and they show all the various steps the vertebrates acquired as they became vertebrates, including the acquisition of pharynx, the notochord, which is the cartilaginous rod that precedes your vertebral column, the segmentation, tail, all those things that define what a vertebrate is. We have various steps along the way. And for example, this step right here, the so-called tunicates or sea squirts, you look at the adults and you say, oh, how the hell is that related to us? A little sack, bag-like thing which is made out of jelly. And there's the adult. But the juvenile is very much like this sort of ancestral form here. It has a tail, has a notochord. But when the juvenile stops swimming and attaches, it goes an amazing metamorphosis and turns into that little sack-like adult. Okay, it's a class example of using larval forms to get from one stage to another. And then here's another step further up here, Amphioxus or Branchiostoma, the lancelet. This is the group that is very fish-like in lots of ways, but doesn't have jaws, doesn't have a true head yet. Okay, and still very common in fresh waters all around the world. And of course, it is known from fossils like Picaya there in the Burgess Shale. So we have good examples of this. And then, of course, creationists don't even pay attention to that old stuff. This is recent stuff that they would never pay attention to, although it's in science. It's hard to miss it. Okay, published in Science just a few years ago. The Chinese now have from the Lower Cambrian the first examples of soft body preservation of true vertebrates. So vertebrates now go all the way back to the beginning of the Cambrian. Like every other phylum on Earth, they're part of the Cambrian explosion. They just soft-bodied, so it takes extraordinary preservation to get them. Okay? So now we have fossils as well as our living representatives to show how vertebrates arose. Okay, we'll jump all the way out of the fishes and right up until amphibians here. I'm going to keep this short, so I don't want to spend too much time on every possible thing. Transitional forms to get to amphibians. Well, this is also one that's been documented for close to a century now. The most famous of these was a set of fossils known as Ichthyostega from the late Devonian, primarily Greenland and Spitsbergen. And these specimens were studied by Swedes, especially Erik Jarvik, and published finally after decades of work. And these are animals which are interesting transitions because they still have fish-like tail fins, they still have fish-like gill slits, they still have the lateral line system, which is the water sensing system that organisms use to pick up electrical currents in the water. So they're fish-like in lots of ways, but they have well-developed hind limbs and forelimbs. Okay, and so that is about as ideal intermediate as you could ask for given the nature of the fossil record. And we can trace that entire sequence by looking at some of the last of the lobe-finned fish, which have these fairly advanced limbs here with these big bony struts. They match up, if the color scheme is not visible in the back, they match up bone for bone with the same elements we have in our hand, or in the case of the hind flippers in our feet. And ultimately, all these elements which were originally part of a fin are co-opted and used part of the vertebrate limb. And this is true not just of their fins and limbs, it's also true of the details of their skull bones, it's true of the details of the vertebral column. Any place you wish to look, you can see this transition. Now, this has gotten more interesting lately. Jenny Clack and her colleagues in Britain have found more specimens. It's always a good idea to get out there and get more stuff when it gets interesting. And their discovery is this animal here, Acanthostega. Here's Ichthyostega again on the bottom. They both have these big tail fins. They both have similar limbs and similar skulls. But the more, Acanthostega is a better preserved animal. We have more of it than we have of Ichthyostega. And it's clear that when we look at it closely now, it turns out these guys, for example, had 8 or 9 fingers. Okay, not 5 like a standard for vertebrates later on. And the evidence from the ear region, from the pelvic girdle, and so on says these things were not walking on land, that their limbs were for walking underwater, which is actually what salamanders spend most of their time doing. If you watch them, they don't spend much time walking on land. Their limbs are primarily for creeping along the bottom. And that's typical of amphibians. There's a reconstruction of Acanthostega there. So it turns out, just because you have limbs doesn't mean you jumped on land right away. I mean, limbs were useful for walking on water first. Okay, and now, of course, there are many, many more of these things now. So here are all these various things. Acanthostega is right here, and here's Ichthyostega, but we have all these other things. We have a variety of things from Elginoperton up to Hynoperton. The transition from fish to amphibian is documented by dozens of different groups now, none of which, of course, creationists will ever talk about. Now, you ask yourself, well, it still seems pretty remarkable, these things crawling out of water, until you realize that's a trick that's been done many times, okay? These are both examples from the modern group of bony fish, which are not even closely related to amphibians, okay? They're the major group of fish we have today. And in several instances, bony fish have found it convenient to crawl out of water too, and they never had the advantages of lobe fins, okay? The mudskipper is probably the most famous example of a fish that spends a lot of its time out of the water, okay? And as those of you who know the Southeast know, the walking catfish is now a great plague because it can get from one pond to another very fast and manages to spread despite all the efforts to eradicate it. There's a whole series of tide pool fish, of sculpins, that walk on land all the time and live out of air for long periods of time. So it's actually a very easy thing to do. It's been done multiple times by different groups. Okay, I won't say much about the transition to reptiles, but we now have some extraordinary specimens, including this one, which was just described a few years ago, nicknamed Lizzie by the British press, West Lothiana, and Hylonomus. 340 million years ago, we now have multiple examples of origin of reptiles. And I'll say just a few things about reptiles. We now have a fossil snake, and you can't see it too well in the back there, but its hind limbs are still there. They're small, but they still have hind limbs. Not that it's any surprise. We knew snakes were originally four-legged creatures because their hip bones are still there, even in living snakes. And we know they're related to the monitor lizard family, the Varanidae, including things like goannas and Komodo dragons, because all the details of anatomy fit that. Crocodilians also, we have good examples of how they originated. The earliest crocodilian, Protosuchus here, shown here on the left. Very small, sort of lizard-like thing, okay? And doesn't look anything like a crocodile today, but we have transitions to all these various body forms of monster extinct crocodiles of all different shapes and sizes. And naturally, of course, and I debated Gwen Dish about this 20 years ago this year on this topic, creationists love to put dinosaurs in their stuff. They know this is the only animal that their audience actually has heard of, okay? In fact, the only extinct animal that any of their audience even knows about, and of course, when most of their audience hears extinct animal, they think it's a dinosaur, that's all they know. Okay, and so they put dinosaurs in the publications because they know the audience expects it, okay? And I had Dwayne Gush, when I was facing him at Purdue University, put this on the screen, an older version of this, showing Triceratops and boldly claiming there were no transitional forms. Well, sorry, Dwayne, you couldn't ask for an example of an animal with more transitional forms than Triceratops, okay? We go all the way back to Hypsilophodon and Protoguanodon, which are classic bipedal ornithopod dinosaurs. Psittacosaurus, which is the first ceratopsian with the distinctive beak and the beginning of a frill. Protoceratops, which has a well-developed frill but no horns. And from there, a huge radiation of the various frills and horns that make up the ceratopsians. I mean, if that's not transitional forms, I don't know what is. Of course, he will deny it. And then he would put Brontosaurus, which is an invalid name, of course, but he doesn't know better, on the screen and say, oh, no transitional forms. Well, once again, wrong, okay? Many bipedal primitive sauropods which walked on two legs, not on four, followed by this huge radiation of all these huge giants that you're also familiar with. Okay, but the real crux of the matter, and this is one they always have to deal with, is the classic transition from dinosaurs, which we now know are the ancestors of birds, to birds. And of course, it goes back to Archaeopteryx. This specimen is in Berlin. I've seen the original, and there is a cast of it. You want to see how big it really looks like. That's a cast of it, okay? There are 7 known specimens of Archaeopteryx, so it was not a common fossil, but it's remarkably good that we have it. It was found only 2 years after Darwin's book appeared, and of course, as soon as it was discovered, it was hailed as the so-called missing link between birds and reptiles, and people immediately had to deal with it. And of course, creationists have to find some way to discredit it. If you read their books, they will say, oh, it's just a bird. Well, they can't do anything otherwise. Obviously, it's got feathers. And their way of looking at the world, it's got feathers, it's a bird. Okay, that's all they can think of. So they have to deny that it has a reptilian tail. It's just this long, bony structure right here, which no living bird has. Okay, they have to deny that it has teeth, which you can see on any well-preserved specimen. They all have it. Okay, no living bird, obviously, today has teeth. And the skeleton, of course, all the rest of it's very dinosaurian. Okay, everything except the feathers and the wishbone. The only thing that makes it a bird is feathers, which actually is dinosaurian, by the way, and a wishbone. That's the really only truly bird-like feature this thing has. And it turns out now, as there's still a couple of dissenters left out there, but virtually all paleontologists agreed dinosaurs gave rise to birds, especially things like Velociraptor, Deinonychus. They're the closest relatives. They have a whole series of distinctive characteristics. This is just a short list right there. If you put Archaeopteryx up next to one of the primitive dinosaurs that it's closely related to, their skeletal features match up almost identically, just some modifications of the hand. And that's about it. Other than that, these are the same thing. And here's a modern bird by comparison, which looks not very much like Archaeopteryx at all. And in fact, one of the 7 known specimens of Archaeopteryx, when it was first described as the little dinosaur Compsognathus. Although you remember Jurassic Park 2, the compies are the little guys running around that picked on the guy and ate him alive. Those are familiar from the same beds which Archaeopteryx comes from, and this thing was misidentified as a dinosaur and then recognized as a bird when they looked again and found the feathers, although, again, that doesn't mean a lot anymore. Now, I won't give you the whole list of characters. Here's just one obvious one. The wrist bones of birds and dinosaurs, and just certain groups of dinosaurs, the dromaeosaurs like Velociraptor, have a distinctive sort of half-moon-shaped wrist bone called the semilunate carpal. And in the Velociraptor, for example, their wrists can only move in this plane because of this half-moon-shaped bone, which is useful if you strike out your prey with your hands. Well, so it turns out, of course, that that motion is very useful in the flight stroke of a wing. All right? It gives the wings a very useful type of thing, too. And that's one of many characters you find in the dinosaurs that led to birds. And then, as those who pay attention to the news know, the last decade now, many, many specimens, primarily from the lower Cretaceous Liaoning beds in China, have come out with extraordinarily soft tissue preservation, including feathers, fur, you name it, body outlines, stomach contents. Extraordinary set of specimens have been found, among which are a number of things which are way too large to have ever been flying, and everybody concedes are dinosaurs in the traditional sense of the word, and they all have feathers. And if you place them on a phylogenetic tree, it means that virtually all predatory dinosaurs, including T-Rex, probably had feathers. Okay? So it turns out feathers don't mean anything because dinosaurs had them for thermoregulation long before flight was ever an issue. Okay? So when you define a bird, you no longer use feathers because that means you've got to put a lot of dinosaurs in the basket too. And Archaeopteryx is by no means the only specimen, right, or the only species. There are 7 specimens of it. Turns out there's a whole slew of these late Jurassic and early Cretaceous Mesozoic birds, which are all nice transitions. So even if they could discredit Archaeopteryx, they've still got 25 other birds to deal with. Okay? I'll just show you a couple of them here. This is an area of explosive research in the last 15 years. All these new species being described. I hardly can keep up with it. There's so much new stuff. This is Cynornis, described by my friend and office mate and early co-author Paul Serino, some of you have heard about. Cynornis is a nice halfway transition because it has a grasping foot like more advanced birds, and it has a fused up pygostyle. This is what happens to the parson's nose when you have your chicken or turkey at Christmas or Thanksgiving. But it still has teeth and it still has a primitive shoulder girdle. Okay? And then down here, Confuciusornis, obviously both these things named after China. Confuciusornis lost the teeth, but it still has the big wing claws, okay, which you can see right there. So I can line up about 25 of these in a row and show you all these steps in the way. Archaeopteryx is just one of many now. All right, but the best transition of all, if you want to make a transition between one major group of animals and another, is the origin of mammals, okay? From these primitive things called synapsids, which used to be called mammal-like reptiles, so that's misleading because they never were reptiles at any time, okay? Synapsids, the big fin-backed Dimetrodon, which is always in the dinosaur kits that kids buy, is not a dinosaur. It's a synapsid. This is the cast of the skull to show you how large these things are, and their fins are like 5 feet tall. It's a very primitive synapsid. The one on the top there is related to those. And they go through a long series of specimens that show progressively more and more mammal-like characteristics, okay? In fact, it's a huge radiation of dozens and dozens of genera and about 25 families before you get to things we call mammals, okay? Most of which are known from places like the Permian of South Africa and Russia, but also here in the Permian of Texas and Oklahoma. And then up in the Triassic, you start getting things that approach mammals, okay? And so it's a gigantic radiation of things. I have here on the table some of these stages here, like some of this herbivorous guy, Dicynodon, and a cast of some of the more advanced guys, and this bear-shaped guy, Cynognathes. Just to show you, again, these are casts, but the originals, of course, are the same size, the same shape. And this is an amazing sequence no matter how you cut it, okay? You can look at the skulls. There's Dimetrodon, this guy right here on the left, going to mammals on the right. Lots of things happen in this transition, and most of it happens in different steps. Some things are advanced in one area and not yet advanced in others. Classic mosaic evolution, where they don't do it all at once. So, for example, they start out with simple peg-like reptilian teeth, but then they start differentiating into big canines and incisors and molars and premolars, and that's all mammals have that now. They start out with a simple little hole right behind the eye, and then it gets larger and larger until they have this huge opening behind the eye, which serves where the jaw muscles come through. It allows the jaw muscles to expand and have the ability to not only bite harder, but to move your jaw side to side and do things that no reptile can do, okay? But the most amazing sequence happens in the lower jaw. In the reptile's lower jaw, this one right here, for example, most of the bones in the jaw are these elements other than the dentary bone, the one that bears the teeth. And then through the evolution of synapsids, all those non-dentary bones get smaller and smaller. Those are the colored ones. And eventually are crowded to the very back of the jaw, and eventually most of them are lost. Well, some of the earliest mammals still have a couple of these reptilian bones in their jaw still, okay? And most of them are lost, but not all of them, because two sets of bones, the bone that's right here in the lower jaw called the articular, and the quadrate bone in the skull, those are the original reptilian jaw hinge, where the jaw connects to the skull. And as these bones become tinier and tinier, that hinge no longer works so well. And eventually, this dentary bone actually reaches up and touches the squamosal bone of the skull, and they get a brand new hinge from a different set of bones. And that's the bone that hinges your jaw right now, the dentary squamosal. So you would think, okay, well, what happens to these bones that were part of the old reptilian hinge? Did they get lost like all the others? No. Where do they go? They go into the ear. Because reptiles, and snakes and lizards all do this, they hear with their lower jaws. Most of them do not have an external eardrum. Okay? And a snake charmer, for example, when it's swaying back and forth with its pipe playing, well, the snake can't hear the pipe. That's for tourists. Right? The snake is following the motion of the body of the snake charmer, because it can't hear when its jaw's not on the ground. Okay? It doesn't go by hearing much anyway. It's not an animal that uses hearing in its hunting. So the bones you're hearing with right now, when you hear my voice, are originally part of your embryonic jaw, the quadrate and articular. And they're in there when you were an embryo to start with. Then they shift from your jaw to your middle ear. And the quadrate bone becomes the incus, or the so-called anvil of your hammer, anvil, and stirrup. And the articular bone of the lower jaw becomes the malleus, or the hammer, that you're hearing with me right now. Okay, so that's what's in the mammal jaw. It's part of your old jaw, ear is part of your old jaw assemblage. And if you couldn't ask for a nicer transition, this one here, because not only is the ear transition happening, this thing is literally known as dararthronathus, a double jaw joint, because here, if you can see it here, here's a close-up of this hinge region of the skull here. Here is the articular bone touching the quadrate, the last of the reptilian hinge, and then the dentary bone touching the squamosal. So it has both sets of hinges operating on each side of its skull simultaneously. So it's right on the cusp between becoming a mammal-hinged and a reptile-hinged jaw. Okay, and this is one particular fossil that shows this. And then, of course, eventually, the other hinge is lost, and it's only dentary squamosal. You go to the advanced synapses, things like the cynodonts, which is a big group, has a whole series of things. These two guys here on the end are both cynodonts, they're fairly advanced mammal-like things. And some are small, some are huge, but they're all incredibly more mammal-like. And it's been a debate now for close to 70 years. Where do you draw the line? When do you decide if one of these things is a mammal or not? I mean, it's so arbitrary because these things are so close to what most people consider mammals at the end of this evolution. Now, my specialty, however, is not dinosaurs or ichthyostega or anything like that. I am a fossil mammal specialist. I have been for many years. And so I'll focus on that for the rest of this talk here. Fossil mammals have an immensely better fossil record than, say, dinosaurs or anything else, because they preserve more often, and they're, especially their hard teeth are very fossilizable. And we have an incredible fossil record, especially at the beginning of the age of mammals, right after dinosaurs died out, of all the radiation of the monogroups of orders of mammals and families of mammals. And between 70 and 50 million years ago, virtually all those groups are known to have originated. We have fossil record of that. So we have the fossil record now of this incredible explosion of everything from insectivores to rabbits to rodents to hyraxes to elephants and manatees to primates and bats, whales, carnivores. You know, there's the 20 or 30 some groups that are alive today and many more extinct groups, all of which appear during this narrow window right after dinosaurs left the planet, except for the birds, of course. And from 50 million years ago, all of them were in place. And most of these guys, you can now trace their fossil record back to common ancestors. In addition to that, we have a new method called cladistic analysis, which has been used in the last 30 years now to really tease apart this relationship in a way that had never been possible before. And then finally, that's part of my research actually, and finally we have now molecular evidence from most of the living species certainly that ties this all together in another way. So we have 3 lines of evidence that tells us how are these things related and when do they originate. And I'll just show you some examples. I can't do all the mammals in a lecture like this, but for example, we have the radiation of the carnivorous mammals, the cat lineage with hyenas and civets and mongooses on one side, the dog and bear lineage, including raccoons and weasels and so on. And we have amazing fossils. This is a gnarly arctos, which is from Sharktooth Hill bone bed up here just north of us near Bakersfield. It's a classic transitional form between a bear and a sea lion, sort of halfway between being aquatic and being fully marine. The skull is still bear-like and primitive in lots of ways, but it does have flippers. Or just within one lineage here, the evolution of fossil cats and their relatives is amazing, well documented. And by the way, saber-tooth, here's the one that from Rancho La Brea up here like 6 times. Okay, being a saber-tooth is not unique. They do it over and over and over again. Now, the group I spend most of my time on is the hoofed mammals, which are easily fossilizable because they're usually large-bodied things. The artiodactyls, the even-toed hoof mammals, perissodactyls, odd-toed ones. The whales, by the way, I'll show you in a moment, are hoof mammals. The ones I spent the most time on are the perissodactyls. My first book ever was published on these. And the perissodactyls today include just horses, rhinos, and tapirs. But they have many extinct fossil groups as well. And they show many, many transitions. This is my particular specialty. My latest book just came out earlier this year on the evolution of North American rhinos. Rhinos evolved in tremendous diversity of body forms, most of which did not have horns. Okay, horns are a late acquisition in rhino history. And they have lots of different body shapes and sizes. Some are small running things, some are big hippo-like things, and the most impressive ones of all were these gigantic andricotheres, which some of you may have seen on Walking with Prehistoric Beasts. That's where I was quoted. These big 20-foot tall beasts that grazed on the tops of trees. Okay? No horn, by the way, just still a rhino. Okay? And if you trace back the earliest rhinos and their relatives, and the earliest tapir and their relative, and the earliest horse and their relatives, to early Eocene 55 million years ago, to the naked eye, these skulls are virtually identical. I have enough experience, I can tell you at a glance which one's which. But you can see, if you're not an expert, they're very similar. Here's a modern tapir by comparison to a fossil tapir. And here's their upper teeth in crown view. And again, I've used these things enough that I can tell them apart. But I remember as an undergraduate, the first time I had experience with Horacotherium and Homogalax, the earliest horse and the earliest tapiroid. And I had all these unsorted teeth in the Bighorn Basin of Wyoming in my class project I had to sort. And I was having a terrible time telling which one was a horse and which one was a tapir. They're so close. I mean, it's just a little bit more development of crests between cusps is the main way you tell it's going to become a tapir and not a horse. And I already talked about horse evolution. I won't say more about that. It's overdone anyways. It was used too often. Now, elephants have an amazing fossil record. Big things like that leave great big fossils behind. So elephants, mastodons, and mammoths can be traced all the way back to an animal called Miratherium. And actually now they have a thing called Pascatherium, which is more primitive than this. Look more like a tapir than any elephant, although they're beginning to have tusks and trunks. But if you saw that 50 million years ago, you would not call it an elephant. Okay? And by the way, their closest relative that's alive today of the elephants and their relatives are the sirenians, manatees and dugongs, the sea cows. There's a manatee right there. And just a couple of years ago, my friend Daryl Domning, that's him there grinning on the left, got to describe an amazing specimen called Pisocyon portelli from the Eocene of Jamaica. This thing has got a classic manatees, dugongs type skull, and even the same kind of teeth that load from the back. It's got these big, heavy, thick ribs that they use for ballast. It's got feet, hands and feet, not flippers. Right? A modern manatee has no hind limbs at all and flippers on the front. Okay, it's a walking manatee. All right, and of course, creationists hate this. Now, this is about as good a transition as you could ask for. Now, to stagger the mind here, the most amazing transition of all is the origin of whales. And of course, whales are of great interest to a lot of people for lots of reasons. There are two great groups of them alive right now. For years, it was very controversial as to where they came from in the mammal family tree. In the 60s, people noticed there's similarities to a big group of extinct hoof mammals, carnivorous hoof mammals, if you can get around that concept, called the mesonychids. Okay? And people said, well, these have skulls that are identical to the earliest whales that we knew at the time. And then, as soon as someone said, well, they're also closely related to even-toed hoof mammals, the creationists put diagrams like this together, from bossy to blowhole. Right? Because creationists don't know much biology, so when they think even-toed hoof mammal, they think of cows. Well, they're on the wrong end of the even-toed hoof mammals. Okay, it turns out hippopotamus is actually a better animal if you want to put something there. Okay, so this is their cartoon of how whales evolved, but artiodactyls are the largest group of hoof mammals alive today. It's not just cows, but camels, pigs, hippos, deer, peccaries, pronghorns, antelope, sheep, tremendous diversity of things. Okay? And the mesonychids are probably actually the distant relative of both these groups. This is the largest of the mesonychids, a thing bigger than a Kodiak bear, which is the largest predator alive today. A huge predatory animal, and these things were already large as whales evolved. Now, this is where creationists are in deep shit, because anytime this gets put up on their screen against them, they don't have an answer. And I've read their literature closely. They hem and haw, but they don't have any way of dealing with this. The transition from mesonychids, or if you prefer hippos, through all these various things to things that everybody would agree is a whale is remarkably well documented. All of this is known now in only the last 15 years. Most of these fossils are discovered in the 80s and 90s and now recently discovered. Starting with the earliest discovery, which is Pakicetus, this thing here, which is apparently partially aquatic, but it still had fully functional whale-like skull. To Ambulocetus, this is the most amazing of all these transitional fossils, known from nearly complete skeleton. There it is right there. The name means the walking, swimming whale. And it's actually more, sort of more like an otter in its locomotion with up and down motion of its spine. But it's also about the size of a crocodile. And this thing was fully developed 4 feet, but probably had web feet. a long tail, yet it has a whale-like skull already. And then up to Darwinistes, and where the feet are starting to be reduced, and the skull is getting larger and much more whale-like still, and it's beginning to move the nostrils from the tip of the nose up to the top where the blowhole goes. Okay, and then to Rhodocetus, which is even more whale-like. The nostrils are up on the top of the skull now like a whale. Its limbs are reduced, but it still has front and hind limbs. Rhodocetus is right there. Okay, and then the whale that have been known for over a century and a half now, the so-called basilosaurid whales or zeuglodont whales. These things are up to 50 feet long. Okay, but they're fully aquatic, and yet they did have these little tiny hind limbs. A 50-foot long whale with a hind limb the size of your arm. Okay, which probably had no function. It was probably vestigial. Okay, all that, of course, is corroborated. We look at a modern whale skeleton today. Here's a photograph of one. There's the hip bones, deep inside the body, have no function whatsoever. They're just sitting there. They're leftovers from the days when whales walked. Okay, and so then from that radiation of all these primitive whales, we have the radiation of the modern baleen whales and the toothed whales, the whales and dolphins that you're familiar with that have teeth. Okay, now you couldn't ask for a better transition. And of course, the creationists again and again don't have any way to answer this. But in fact, they don't give a damn, right? In reality, creationists don't care about any other organism except Homo sapiens, right? They only have to care about them when they have to debate one of these paleontologists to get in their way. But the only organism that really matters to them is Homo sapiens, right? And they would concede all the rest with any argument they could if they could get around the fact that they cannot live with the idea that humans are members of the animal kingdom, that are closely related to great apes, especially chimpanzees. And that's where they spend most of their energy. This is the place where they definitely draw the line. They will not allow us to be related to the animal kingdom. They will not allow us to be, as Desmond says here, the ape's reflection. Okay? And this goes back even older than evolution, of course. This is where the idea of missing link was most frequently applied. It's, as we said, a part of this pre-Darwinian great chain of being notion, which has no place in modern biology, but frequently gets pulled out of the woodwork, is used by people who think in those 200-year-old terms. If you want to think about missing links, you could point to intermediate fossils galore, like I just did for the last half hour, and any one of them could be called a missing link. But as some of you know who've dealt with creationists, and I had this happen to me too, you put one of these on the screen when you debate them, and they say, oh, well then how do you get between that fossil and this fossil? You know, and how do you get from that fossil to the other side, right? I put Ambulocetus on the screen. Well, how do you get from Ambulocetus to a terrestrial animal to a whale? Well, I have all those gaps too. But they don't usually live with that. They ask you for more, you know. If you come up with one, they demand more, right? And that's a pretty slick way to play the game, as you can see. For example, if the hominid fossil record were just one exceptional fossil, it should be sufficient to do the proof, right? And in fact, in 1920, Raymond Dart described the famous tongue baby, Australopithecus africanus, the first true, if you want to think of it in these terms, missing link ever described. It was not a member of our genus, and yet it was clearly not an ape. Okay? It was something intermediate. So that alone should have been enough at that point, of course. And for most people it was, but creationists no. But of course, creationists demand more and more intermediate fossils. They always try to, in their literature, say, well, Australopithecus is just an ape. Well, it's bipedal, it has small brow ridges, it has a flat face. No ape like that has ever been in existence. Okay? And if you insist on adding more to the story, if you have to get all those links in there, well, the hominid fossil record is damn better than it was in 1920. This is just a small part of one museum's collection. This is after the discovery of Lucia, Australopithecus afarensis, and they put a lot of specimens on tables to show you just one museum's collection of hominids, okay? And now there are multiple places in the world where they have thousands of hominid specimens. Not as good as the rhino collections I work with, but still, hominids are much better known than they were even 30 years ago. Now, that doesn't mean that they won't try to somehow distort the hominid fossil record and get around these things. So this is a famous little pamphlet from Jack Chick Publications called Big Daddy, that some of you may have seen before. Sort of a classic in creationist bizarreness. And in the middle of it, it has our famous March of Hominids Through Time, which of course is the wrong icon to begin with. And then in every one of these cases here, they're trying to discredit human evolution by somehow saying, well, this particular thing does not bear up to scrutiny. Well, yes and no, okay? For example, they say Peking man, well, specimens are all lost. Yeah, that's true. The original collections of the so-called Peking man, Homo erectus, from the Zhoukoudian caverns in China were lost during the Second World War when the Japanese invaded. But they had casts of all those specimens in many museums, and there are many more specimens now in existence. So that's a semi-lie, right? Saying, oh, they don't exist anymore. Well, no, the fossils are both represented by casts and by new material, okay? Well, Piltdown man was a forgery, but that's, you know, that happens in science. Those things are a problem. New Guinea man's only something creationists talk about. No anthropologist claims that's anything but human. Likewise, Cro-Magnon man and Neanderthal man, well, they say, oh, well, it's based on a diseased individual. The earliest complete skeleton of it was a diseased individual, but we have many non-diseased individuals now, and it's definitely not us. Okay, and so on and so forth. That's the typical their way of approaching things. Try to discredit in 3 or 4 cases, ignore 90% of the data. The so-called Nebraska man case that you saw up there, this is an honest scientific mistake. Henry Fairfield Osborne, a little bit overzealous. He got this single isolated tooth from the Pliocene beds of western Nebraska, and he said, looks like a hominid to me. You know, we got humans in western Nebraska, which is something he wanted to believe in. All of his colleagues said, no, don't get so carried away. There's something wrong here. Turns out it's not only not a hominid tooth, it's a tooth of a peccary, a javelina. Some of you have seen these in the zoos around here. They're very common in the Central and South America. And that's not that surprising, right? Pigs and peccaries have very similar teeth to us because they're omnivores like us, and their tight teeth are designed to eat about the same kind of diet. Okay, now the creationists, of course, then jump on this and say, well, they didn't correct it. Scientists corrected this. But of course, scientists do get carried away, so this is the famous reconstruction that was done before they realized what it was. Okay? And then, of course, in the previous image there, they say, it was found to be a tooth of a pig. No, pigs and peccaries are different families. Okay, they don't know the difference, but of course they're not much of a biologist to begin with. All right, so what does a hominid fossil really look like? Here's the hominid fossil record as it was just a couple of years ago. There's a couple of new things I didn't put on here. We have fossils going all the way to 6 or 7 million years ago and up through today. And what's striking about it, I didn't show the relationships here, I'm just showing their time ranges. It's extremely bushy or branching no matter how you connect these things. And sometimes in geologic past, there's been as many as 5 or 6 different things that are called hominids, members of our family, coexisting in South and East Africa at the same time, found in the same beds. Okay, so right now, we're practically the only time in hominid history where there's only one of us. And, just 30,000 years ago, when Neanderthals were around, there were 2 different members of our family alive. Okay, and then to show you this fossil record is extremely dense, I'll just quickly throw some images of some of these guys. This is the new discovery a couple of years ago, Sahelanthropus chadensis from Chad. 6 to 7 million years old, already bipedal. About the time that hominids branched from other apes, we were already bipedal. And then this is the famous skull of Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis. I have a hard time reading here, but it's this one down here. The most complete skeleton that goes back that far. This is the famous black skull, which is a very primitive member of Paranthropus, Paranthropus ethiopicus. And then the most famous thing that Louis Leakey made his reputation on, this is, of course, so-called Nutcracker Man, Dear Boy, that Mary Leakey called it. They made their reputations and careers. Zinjanthropus was its original name. It's now called Australopithecus boisei, most hyper-robust of all the anthropoids. And this is what made Richard Leakey's career. This is the famous KMNR ER 1470. This famous specimen was originally called Homo habilis. It's now Homo rudolfensis. It's the first member of our genus to be known, and it goes back almost 2 million years ago. Okay, and then this is also Richard Leakey and Alan Walker's discovery. This is the famous Narekatomi boy, a young individual, teenage individual, a nearly complete skeleton, found in West Turkana about 20 years ago. And now, in other words, it's the fossil record. I could show hundreds of these things, but I won't go on and on. The point is being we have incredible material now for human evolution, 90% of which the creationists never talk about. All right, and even if there were not a single hominid fossil, it wouldn't matter. Because we still know we're closely related to chimps and gorillas, because that's in our DNA. In fact, 98% of your DNA is the same as a chimp's. Okay? Like less than a little over 1% actually makes all the difference between you and a chimpanzee, and it mostly is what are called regulatory genes that shut on and off all the rest of the genes you have and make you into what you are. Okay? That alone should be sufficient, but of course it's not. So we heard Jared Diamond mentioned. He will, I guess, be appearing here pretty soon. But one of his earlier books, a very interesting book when he was doing mostly biology, not so much anthropology, was The Third Chimpanzee. The title refers to the fact that if you took a bunch of DNA samples of different organisms and gave them to an alien, to DNA sequence, right, a very smart alien, right, they would say that humans' DNA is so similar to the other 2 species of chimpanzee that we're just a 3rd species of chimpanzee. Right? In terms of DNA, there isn't any real difference. We're more similar to the other 2 species of chimpanzee than any groups of 3 species you can name anywhere on Earth. Okay, that's how similar we are. Okay. Well, I bored you with a lot of science here. Let's get to the politics, all right? Why do we give a damn? Why does it matter, right? Is this just some sort of, innocent little thing where a bunch of fundamentalists can influence a few schools in South, southern part of the US and the rest of us can ignore them. No. It has national implications, it has global implications, and there are a whole bunch of reasons why we have to actually take an active role as much as we can in fighting creationism and preventing them from infecting our schools. And there's a lot of reasons to say this. First of all, it's a denial of reality, just like denying the Holocaust, okay? Evolution not only happened, it's happening all the time. We have evolution going on in lots of cases. I'll just show you a few in a second here. I'll show you in a moment why denying evolution can actually be deadly. You can make grotesque mistakes if you can't live with evolution. But more importantly, evolution is the central unifying theme of biology. And without it, biology makes no sense whatsoever. Okay? And most of the people who debate evolution and the creationist side are not biologically trained, because that's the hardest thing to live with. Okay? And more importantly, it's a wedge. It's an attempt to start by attacking evolution as sort of the most prominent thing they don't like about science, and their worldview doesn't jibe with it. But of course, eventually, geology, astronomy, anthropology, a whole series of other things that don't match the Genesis literal interpretation are their targets. And finally, the last and the most practical economic terms, if you want to be more dollars and cents about this, science literacy in America is among the worst in the civilized world, or at least certainly in the westernized world, and creationism is a good part of the reason for that. Okay, let's go over all those points. Evolution didn't just happen in the past, it's happening right now. Animals evolve, whether we like it or not, they're going to keep evolving. Okay? You can deny it, but it doesn't change the fact it exists. Just like you can deny gravity, but it doesn't change the fact it exists. And these are, in this natural history article that Michael just mentioned here, these are some modern examples, things that have been observed evolve in human timescales. A variety of different things here. You can go look it up if you like. I won't spend a lot of time. But this is the famous old textbook case of the peppered moth, Biston bechellaria, which went through a very dramatic case of natural selection. The natural peppered moth looks like this. And then when the trees in Britain and the industrial world got very sooty during the peak of the Industrial Revolution, they became conspicuous. So the natural selection picked off all the peppered guys, and the sooty guys are the only ones that persisted. And now that they've cleaned up the air in Britain, the peppered guys are back, and these melanic forms are rare. Okay, but yeah, there's evolution in stickleback fishes, there's evolution in the birds of Hawaii, there's evolution of a variety of things going on all the time. But the real master for rapid evolution in our time scale, of course, is in your body right now. Okay? Microorganisms, bacteria and viruses are the most rapidly evolving of all organisms. The reason, of course, we have a brand new strain of flu every year is because they change their protein code on the outside, and they are unrecognizable to your immune system, at least initially, and that's how they infect you. And they do this virtually every year, right? They evolve so fast that you get a new flu strain, and usually several new flu strains every year. And of course, other vector viruses like HIV/AIDS, okay, that still hasn't been mastered by our immune system. It attacks it instead. Okay, and it evolved only fairly recently, as far as we can tell. All right, so not only denying that this thing is occurring, it's not only just plain old denying reality, it hampers research, it puts people's lives at risk. If you had creationists doing molecular biology, we would be in deep shit. But it's even worse than that, okay? Some of you have heard about Loma Linda University out there in Riverside County, run by the Seventh-day Adventists, who are, by the way, creationists, okay? You might have heard, those who are old enough to remember this case now 20 years ago, the famous surgery where they placed a baboon heart in a human baby called Baby Faye. And of course, poor soul, she died a couple of days later because her immune system rejected the baboon heart. Now, that should not have been a surprise, and Bailey's use of the baboons was surprising, and this is the quotation from the article. Given their relatively distant evolutionary relationship to humans compared to primates, if you're going to put a primate heart in a human that's not a human heart, you'd use a chimp, not a baboon, right? They're closer, right? The reason came to light when the Times of London published an interview between Bailey and an Australian radio crew. The reporters have been forbidden to ask direct questions about the operations. They queried Bailey about the issue why he had chosen baboon in view of baboons' evolutionary distance from humans. Bailey replied, I find that difficult to answer. You see, I don't believe in evolution. I certainly wouldn't want him cutting me. It's shocking that Bailey ignored basic biological concepts formulating a life-threatening human experiment. Basically, Baby Faye died in vain because this guy didn't believe in evolution. Okay? Now, that's very practical, but in a very broad term, it's practical to think about biology. Biology is synthesized, the central element that ties all of biology together: genetics, embryology, systematics, biogeography, behavior. All of that is evolutionary, and we would have heard an evolution psychologist say that. Now psychology is added to that synthesis of this. So studying biology without evolution is nonsense. And the great geneticist Theodor Dansky put it, nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution. That's been true now for close to 200 years. But it isn't just biology, right? They made no secret, and if you read their literature closely, they say this in black and white, that evolution is just their obvious target. It's the weakest, most vulnerable part of American science because that's the part the most public misunderstands and has doubts about. But they have every intention of replacing real geology with so-called flood geology. And then if they did that, of course, there would no longer be any real search for gas oil because you couldn't use flood geology to find it. And obviously, Genesis 1 would replace astronomy. Of course, they can't live with the Big Bang. You can imagine that. And of course, Adam and Eve would replace paleoanthropology. You just think of the list of things that they would do. So here is a cartoon version of this. We could have this equal-handed approach here, teach both theories, which is the way they try to get into our fair-minded legal system here. Chemistry versus alchemy, phrenology versus neurology, magic versus physics, or astrology versus astronomy. I mean, a lot of the public doesn't know the difference between these fields still, but that's another issue. Okay? And that brings us to our last point here, scientific illiteracy. This result of decades of creationist attacks on science and generally ignorance of science and our culture in general is already clear. You can look at any recent ranking of science scores of students of any grade from 4th grade up through high school, and in fact adults as well. And we're always near the bottom of the 20 or so countries and westernized countries that they rank. Usually Japan and China are near the top. Netherlands, Iceland, Canada, Sweden, Switzerland, and Germany always in the top 10. We're usually the bottom or the third from the bottom. Okay? And this is just down the line, consistent every time they test us. Very high percentage of Americans still think very bizarre things, as everyone in this society knows. Pseudoscience is our main focus here. Think that the sun revolves around the earth, think that humans live with dinosaurs. Can't tell science from pseudoscience. That's still, you know, no matter what number you think, there's 40, 50% of the country believes these bizarre ideas. And this is despite all of our spending on education. In reality, actually, a lot of that spending is misplaced. If you read the recent articles and the research that is done on this, they say that in particular this new effort by the Bush administration, the No Child Left Behind thing, what it's actually done to education is force people to teach to the test. And the tests that they take are in math and English and in things like that. Rarely are they tested on science, which means science gets left out. When time is of essence, whatever is on the test and keeps their test scores higher gets taught first. So what does this say for the future of our country when the population is scientifically illiterate or believes in pseudoscience, which is fundamentally the same thing, at a technologically advanced time? And one of the few advantages we used to have over the rest of the world, we don't have advantages in cheap labor, obviously, we don't have advantages in many other things now. We farm all of our work over to India. One of the few things we used to be the best in the world at was science and technology. But it doesn't look very good for us if we're falling that far behind most of the rest of the world, and will in another generation. Okay, so I know this won't be legible in the back. I'll read this out to you. This is just a priceless little cartoon. This is the Leave Your Child Behind Act. Hey, parents, are you concerned that your child will grow up to be an intellectual elite? Then urge your school district to adopt the Leave Your Child Behind curriculum. There's no fancy book learning except the literal reading of the good book. And then here the teacher says, NASA research proves the sun really stood still in the sky. And then the caption says here, actual lesson being taught in 300 school districts. Obviously, fundamentalist influence school districts, right? The sun stood still. Highfalutin critical thinking is discouraged as students are told everything they need to know. And the teacher says, European settlers in America liberated the Indians. And one of the students says, but I heard, you heard wrong. And then the next frame here, we're also retooling the traditional grading system. So this student has an A. Oh no, I got an arrogant. And this one has an F+. I got a freedom plus. In the end, all of our graduates receive special degrees. Okay? Congratulations, young lady. Aren't you glad you decided against a career in science? Duh. And finally here, as they say, all say duh together. Enroll your child today because freedom is on the march. Okay, so final take-home point here. We have choices we can make. We can let fanatical religious minorities dictate public policy and drag our science education literacy back to the Middle Ages and see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil with their Bibles covering their various parts. Or we can come to terms with the world which Darwin led us, now almost 150 years ago. In Darwin's words, there's grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed in the Creator into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone on cycling according to the fixed laws of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. Thank you. willing to take questions for as long as I can physically stand, although baby kept me awake last night, so I didn't get a lot of sleep, but I'll do my best here. We had a question right there. Go ahead.
Your hominid chart didn't show any evolution in the chimps and the apes. They must have changed during the last...
Yeah, their fossil record is relatively poor, and it's because we think they mostly evolved in the tropical regions, especially tropical rainforests, which have almost no fossil record. So we have a handful of really decent specimens of fossil apes that precede the chimps and the gorillas, and there's not a lot of fossils for them. That's one of those things we don't have. So we can't say much about them other than we know they were there 6 million years ago, and they're still here. It's hard for me to see in these lights here. There's a hand. Go ahead.
What's the latest on the new small people?
Oh, the ones from Borneo, is that one you're thinking of? They're probably a distinct species. I'm not enough an anthropologist to have my own first-hand opinions on that, but I've read the literature. They do seem to be a dwarfed species, smaller than any human hominid or human that's alive today. And you could make an argument that they were a dwarf on an island, and that's a very common phenomenon. The big problem there is not so much with their scientific interpretation, because that's relatively straightforward. It's who owns the bones and who has the right to keep collecting, and that got to be really sticky. But yes, I would say that's reasonable to think that they're an unusual dwarf species that lived on that island and dwarfed there and never lived anywhere else. That's within reason. Okay, we had some hands over there. Go ahead.
Yes. Is there any evidence there was intimate relations between Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal?
Oh, yes. The question for those who didn't hear it, whether Cro-Magnons, or at least Homo sapiens of that time, right, and Neanderthals interbred. They do overlap in time by quite a bit. Okay, there's a famous famous cave in northern Israel which has a series of deposits. It's called Shkul, which is spelled like the word skull. And they actually have interbedding where they have Neanderthals, and then they have Homo sapiens, and then Neanderthals again. So that proves definitely that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals lived in the same places. Beyond that, it's speculation, right? I mean, we know Neanderthals, generally speaking, were mostly northern and central Europe, and the more modern Homo sapiens, which originated earlier, is mostly from Middle East south. And there's not many places where they live coexisting. It's not likely they interbred if they were as different as we know they are, but again, there's no scientific evidence one way or another beyond that. Well, we know they were coexisting for thousands of years, though. Okay, I can't see you guys in the far back corner here. Just one hand at a time. I'll let you.
Is it fair to say 98% of the ideas reside in the United States?
Michael could answer that.
Yeah.
It's virtually an all U.S. movement.
What was the question?
Mostly from the Discovery Institute up there in Seattle. It's largely the base for that one group.
They're genetically different.
He asked, the question was, do all the IDs, intelligent design creationists, live in the U.S.? Yes, it's basically a U.S. movement. I don't think it has much of a following elsewhere yet. Now, there's another hand up there in the bright lights.
Are changes in life expectancy purely a function of condition, or is there some evolutionary link to that? And secondly, why did certain countries that are fundamentalist religious evolve and give us modern mathematics and astronomy, such as the Middle East?
Okay, compound question. Let me do it one piece of time. The first question is, what was it about?
Changes in life expectancy.
Life expectancy. Okay, the problem you have with dealing with human evolution in the last few 100,000 years or so is that you have both biological evolution, which is fairly slow, right? It's very difficult to move species from one place to another, and cultural evolution, which is very, very fast. Okay, which is largely what humans have done. I mean, many of us in this room would not be alive today if we didn't have our glasses and our various other aids that make us able to survive, right? That's all cultural. That's nothing biological going on there. Biologically speaking, we're not very fit. And so in that regard, it's hard to know, because some people would argue that humans have not evolved biologically much at all in the last, say 30, 40,000 years, that we pretty much have reached a stable plateau, and we're compensating for our biological problems by cultural evolution. And so whether there's been any real biological evolution of humans since then is a good question. There's a lot of debate among anthropologists on that. Now, what your second question was?
About, for instance, the Middle East, which gave us mathematics and astronomy.
Right.
At the same time being fundamentalist religion.
Right.
What do you draw from that?
That's an interesting twist, yes. The early days of Islam, when it spread from the Middle East and, of course, all the way across the Mediterranean, was also a period of time where they were intellectually way ahead of the Europeans of their time, right? They spread mathematics and algebra, which they invented, and a lot of other things, and they preserved written documents that the Europeans were routinely destroying. And so it's interesting, although the Muslim fundamentalist culture is different from American Christian fundamentalist culture in lots of ways, among which Muslim fundamentalists, at least until recently, were much more, certainly the ones of those centuries, valued scholarship in a way that certainly maybe the fundamentalists of Iran and Iraq don't now. I don't know enough about all the details of their history to tell you more than that. But yes, I mean, I'm not saying fundamentalism per se is the reason, but there are certainly a lot more narrow-minded people among fundamentalists than about any other group you can name. That's probably a valid generalization. Okay, there's a hand right there next to you.
For all of us sitting in this room, short of joining a school board or becoming a biology teacher, what do we do to halt the forces of darkness?
Yeah, that's always a good question. I mean, all of us have only so much time in our lives, and the biggest issue is there are certain places and times where a little bit of effort makes a lot of difference. Okay, like when a certain school board, and especially if you're a resident of the area where a school board is doing something, that's when it's worth your time to get out there and show up at their late night meetings and make a big fuss. And there are networks. You can look online. The National Center of Science Education has a big network, keeps track of all the creationists doing. So it's easy to keep track of it if you're interested in doing it. That's where you have the biggest influence. That, and especially if you're a member of an electorate that elects school boards in states like Kansas or Pennsylvania, okay, then the real issue there is that's where you can also make the biggest difference, is making sure that school boards like the one currently in power in Kansas, which was voted out once and then voted back in again, and now doing another job embarrassing the state of Kansas twice. That's where you can make the biggest difference. If you have more time in your hands, of course, there's a lot more you can do. And look at the NCSC website, and there's just tons of stuff going on. If it's something if you have the interest and time, there's no limit to what you can join in and take part in. Okay, question down there in front of you.
How do you answer those who accept microevolution but will deny macroevolution?
Well, that's like having your cake and eat it too, right? I mean, most of the time creationists don't want to concede any kind of evolution at all. And then you push them on something like some of those examples I had on the screen there, and they say, oh, well, that's just microevolution. We only, we'll concede that because they're within the created kinds, or the baramin of the Bible, okay, which is a mistranslation of Hebrew. I learned enough Hebrew to know that. And so then you have to pin them down, because they say, oh, well, macroevolution is something that's impossible. Well, most of the examples I just showed you there were macroevolutionary. Transition from reptiles, dinosaurs to birds is about as macro as you get. And those are the ones they really spend their efforts trying to deny, because that they cannot live with. Okay, now there was someone there who got missed. Go ahead.
You mentioned about the school board. I think it's kind of a narrow attack on how to change what you talk about religious minority dictating policy. What do you do when you've got a government that's complicit in
Well, you hope to get voted out the next time around, is what you hope. Yeah, no, I mean, if there's a really interesting book called The Republican War on Science, it's out. Just, what's the author? I can't remember the author's name. Just came out. Just shocking what the Republican Congress and this administration have done to our science research. Yeah, there's some instances of that too. I mean, pork barrel goes both ways. The bigger issue is that when it becomes an issue in an election, that's when you have the most influence. That's when they are actually on the spot, and hopefully enough influence can sway them. Beyond that, once they're in office, there's not a lot you can do except protest. And I look at this. I mean, I personally had a big stake in this. I've debated Gish. I've written stuff. I try not to get too involved in it, because largely it just takes too much time, and I don't have that time to spare. But if you stand back and look at it in the broad view, a lot of this has to do with the way in which political trends and social trends in this country go. The creationists come out of the woodwork when we go through conservative times. The 1920s through the 1970s, Reagan years, until now. Okay, they tend to disappear when we go through progressive times. They were virtually invisible during the FDR years. They were virtually visible until the late part of the Kennedy-Johnson administration. When the country becomes progressive, they don't have an audience. When the country is conservative, they for a while have an audience, but then when the country starts thinking about more important things, they realize that creationists are wasting their time. And that's why I don't think you can't eradicate it, you can't do anything to legislate it. It's very hard to fight them, except as sort of a holding action, and then just hope that winds of political change will come and help and make them go back in the woodwork.
Take one more question.
Yes, go ahead.
I'm thinking of the evolution of dogs helped along by humans. We have about 200 species of dogs, and new ones are created within a human lifetime.
Right.
Maybe a lot less than that. What do the creationists say about that?
Well, that's artificial selection, right? That applies to almost all domesticated animals and a bunch of others that were never domesticated but just learned to live with us. And artificial selection was one of Darwin's classic cases of showing how much a species could change if you put heavy selection on them, in the case of humans by domestication. Creationists, generally speaking, don't care about that, because when you push them on that, they say, oh, again, that's micro. You know, that's within a created kind, the dog kind or the cat kind. And that's allowed by their broad interpretation of Genesis, the so-called baramine or kinds in the Bible. And that was one place where they will generally back off if you push them. But of course, you look hard at it, you know, for example, what we've done to dogs to domesticate them, if they were alive in that form in nature, they'd all be distinct species. They're not technically that way because they all interbreed, although Chihuahuas and Great Danes would have a hard time making it work. But most dogs can interbreed, and they're pretty ingenious, as you know. So.
Well, thank you all for coming. Let's thank our
Thank you.